The Boston skyline stretched endlessly against the November sky, glass towers reflecting the cold afternoon light like shards of ice. Alexander Thornton stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the city that both feared and respected his name. At 34, he had built an empire from the ruins of his father's mistakes, transforming Thornton Industries from a struggling manufacturing company into one of the most influential conglomerates on the East Coast. His reputation preceded him in every boardroom, every charity gala, every whispered conversation in Boston's elite circles. Ruthless, they called him. Uncompromising. A man who made decisions with his mind, never his heart, and who had spent the last decade locked in a bitter rivalry with the Blackwell family. A conflict that had cost both sides millions, relationships, and any semblance of peace. The war between the Thorntons and the Blackwells had begun long before Alexander took the helm. His father and Marcus Blackwell Sr. had once been business partners, brothers in ambition, until a devastating betrayal split their alliance and ignited a feud that consumed 2 generations. Contracts were stolen, deals sabotaged, reputations smeared in carefully orchestrated campaigns that left both families bleeding resources and pride. When Alexander's father died of a heart attack 5 years ago, many assumed the young Thornton would seek reconciliation. Instead, he doubled down, expanding into territories the Blackwells considered sacred, purchasing properties they coveted, hiring away their best executives with offers they couldn't refuse. Marcus Blackwell Jr., who had inherited his father's empire with equal determination, responded with matching aggression. The business world watched their collision like spectators at a demolition derby, wondering which titan would crumble first. Alexander had learned early that sentiment was a liability. After his mother abandoned the family when he was 12, unable to withstand the pressure of his father's obsessive pursuit of success, he had closed off the parts of himself that yearned for connection. His younger sister, Caroline, was the only person who ever saw him smile genuinely, but even she had distanced herself in recent years, married to a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley and building a life far from the shadows of family warfare. Alexander told himself he preferred the solitude, the clarity that came from operating without emotional entanglements. His penthouse was immaculate and empty, decorated by professionals who understood aesthetics but not warmth. He worked 16-hour days, attended obligatory social functions with beautiful women who never stayed longer than necessary, and filled the silence with strategy, always 3 moves ahead of his opponents. That afternoon, his assistant, Margaret, a sharp woman in her 50s who had been with him since the beginning, knocked softly before entering. She carried a tablet and an expression that immediately signaled something unusual had developed. Alexander turned from the window, his dark eyes questioning, and she cleared her throat before speaking. The Blackwell acquisition in Beacon Hill, the historic property they had been circling for months, had fallen through at the last moment. Their sources reported that Marcus Blackwell had withdrawn from the deal entirely, redirecting his attention to something in the western suburbs, a location that made no strategic sense given their portfolio. Margaret suggested they investigate, perhaps leverage the opportunity, but something in the report caught Alexander's attention beyond the business implications. The property Marcus had abandoned was a sprawling estate in a secluded area, purchased through a shell company and immediately sealed off with security and privacy measures that seemed excessive, even for the notoriously secretive Blackwell operations. Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of sending investigators or corporate spies, he would go personally. Margaret protested, citing security concerns and the impropriety of the head of Thornton Industries conducting reconnaissance like a common detective. But Alexander dismissed her objections with a wave of his hand. Something about the situation felt off, and his instincts, honed through years of navigating treacherous business waters, rarely steered him wrong. He wanted to see with his own eyes what Marcus Blackwell considered valuable enough to abandon a prime downtown acquisition. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the city, Alexander drove his black Mercedes through Boston's winding streets toward the western suburbs, leaving behind the familiar territory of skyscrapers and high-stakes negotiations for something that felt uncomfortably like the unknown. The estate sat at the end of a private road, surrounded by dense woods that had already surrendered their leaves to the approaching winter. Security cameras dotted the perimeter, but Alexander had come prepared, using knowledge obtained through perfectly legal channels about blind spots and maintenance schedules. He parked his car a half-mile away and approached on foot, his expensive shoes crunching against gravel and dead leaves, his breath visible in the cold air. The main house was dark, but a smaller building at the rear of the property glowed with dim light filtering through curtained windows. Alexander moved closer, his heart rate elevating not from fear, but from the electric sense that he was about to discover something significant, something that would shift the careful balance he had maintained for so long. He reached the building, a converted carriage house with ivy climbing its brick walls, and peered through a gap in the curtains. What he saw stopped him completely. Inside, sitting on a simple wooden chair in a sparsely furnished room, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and eyes that held a depth of sadness that struck Alexander like a physical blow. She wore a white dress that seemed ceremonial, formal, utterly out of place in the stark surroundings. Her wrists bore faint marks, not from restraints but from what looked like traditional binding patterns, decorative but symbolically heavy. She sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, her expression one of profound resignation, as though she had already accepted a fate she had no power to change. Alexander's mind raced through possibilities, connecting fragments of information he had gathered over the years about Blackwell family traditions, their obsession with legacy and strategic alliances. This woman was clearly not being held against her will in any conventional sense. There were no locks on the door he could see, no guards posted, but her imprisonment was evident in every line of her posture, every shadow in her eyes. She was trapped by something far more binding than chains, trapped by expectation, duty, family obligation. And then the pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Marcus Blackwell was planning a marriage, an arranged union designed to cement an alliance with another powerful family, securing resources and influence that would tip the scales decisively in his favor. This woman was the bride, isolated here until the ceremony, kept away from the world that might offer her alternatives or hope. Alexander should have turned away. This discovery gave him leverage, information he could use to disrupt Marcus's plans, perhaps even destroy the alliance before it formed. That was the smart play, the strategic move that aligned perfectly with everything he had built his career on. But as he stood in the cold darkness watching this stranger sit alone in her gilded cage, something shifted inside him, something he thought he had buried permanently beneath years of calculated detachment. He saw his mother in her, the woman who had suffocated under the weight of obligations she never chose. He saw Caroline, who had fled across the country to escape the crushing expectations of their family name. He saw every person who had ever been used as a pawn in someone else's game of power. Alexander Thornton made a choice in that moment that would change everything, a choice that defied logic, strategy, and self-preservation. He would not use this woman as leverage. He would not exploit her situation for advantage. Instead, he would free her, even if it cost him everything he had spent years building, even if it ignited a firestorm that would consume both families, even if the entire world that knew him would never understand why. Alexander stood frozen in the darkness for several minutes, his breath creating small clouds in the November air as his mind wrestled with the implications of what he was about to do. Every instinct cultivated through years of business warfare screamed that this was foolish, reckless, a deviation from strategy that would leave him vulnerable. Yet something deeper, something he had suppressed for so long it felt almost foreign, pushed him forward with an urgency he couldn't ignore. He moved away from the window and circled the building, testing doors with careful precision, until he found one that opened with a soft click into a small mudroom adjacent to the main space where the woman sat. The interior was warm, heated by a system that hummed quietly in the background. And Alexander could smell lavender, perhaps from sachets placed around the room in some misguided attempt to make a prison feel like a sanctuary. He stepped inside, his footfalls deliberate but not silent, not wanting to terrify her with a sudden appearance. The woman turned her head slowly, and when her eyes met his through the doorway, he saw no fear, only a weary acceptance that made his chest tighten. She had been expecting someone, perhaps guards checking on her, perhaps Marcus himself coming to issue final instructions before whatever ceremony awaited her. Alexander moved into the light, and recognition flickered across her features, confusion replacing resignation as she processed the face of a man who should not be there, whose presence in this place made no sense according to any logic she understood. She stood, the white dress flowing around her like water, and her voice when she spoke was soft but steady, marked by an accent that suggested years spent somewhere in the American South before being transplanted to Boston's colder climate. She asked who he was, and Alexander found himself strangely reluctant to give his name, knowing it would transform him from a potential rescuer into another player in the deadly game that had brought her here. But he had never been a liar, and he wouldn't start now. He identified himself simply, watching her eyes widen as the name Thornton registered, watching her take an involuntary step backward as the reality of their family's hatred settled between them like a physical barrier. She said nothing for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for intention, for threat, for whatever truth she might find in the features of her family's greatest enemy. Alexander raised his hands slowly, a gesture of peace that felt absurdly inadequate given the circumstances, and told her he wasn't there to hurt her, wasn't there to use her as a weapon against the Blackwells. He was there, he said with a conviction that surprised him, to offer her a choice. Her name was Elena Morrison, she told him finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The Morrison family controlled textile manufacturing throughout the Southeast. Old money that had survived the Civil War, the Depression, and every economic upheaval since by adapting and enduring. Her father had negotiated the arrangement with Marcus Blackwell 6 months ago, a merger of families that would bring the Morrisons into Boston's elite circles, while providing the Blackwells with manufacturing resources and Southern political connections they had long coveted. Elena had been raised to understand duty, to accept that her role was to strengthen her family's position through strategic marriage, just as her mother had done, and her grandmother before that. She had met Marcus only 3 times, formal dinners where he spoke to her father while she sat silently, decorative and disposable, her opinions never requested, her feelings never considered. Alexander listened as she spoke, heard the careful control in her voice that suggested years of training in suppressing her own desires, and felt anger rising in him, not the cold, calculated fury he employed in boardrooms, but something hotter, more personal. He asked her if this was what she wanted, and her answer came after a pause that stretched too long, a single word, no, spoken so quietly he almost missed it. But that no carried the weight of 25 years of unspoken rebellion, of dreams deferred and possibilities strangled before they could breathe. Alexander moved closer, careful to maintain distance that wouldn't frighten her, and explained his proposal. He would take her away from here, tonight, before the wedding that was scheduled to take place in just 3 days. He would provide protection, resources, whatever she needed to build a life on her own terms, free from the obligations that had defined her existence. Elena stared at him as though he had spoken a foreign language, her mind clearly struggling to process an offer that contradicted everything she had been taught about how the world worked, especially the world of powerful families and inherited obligations. She asked the question he'd been expecting, the one he had no good answer for. Why would he do this? Why would Alexander Thornton, who had spent years trying to destroy the Blackwells, help the woman his enemy intended to marry? He could have told her it was strategy, that freeing her would humiliate Marcus and disrupt his plans more effectively than any corporate maneuver. He could have lied and said he wanted leverage, a hostage of his own. Instead, he told her the truth, or as much of it as he understood himself. He was tired of watching people be crushed by systems that valued power over humanity, tired of being part of a cycle that destroyed everything tender and genuine in pursuit of victory that tasted like ash. The vulnerability in his admission seemed to reach her in a way logical arguments never could. Elena's shoulders, which had been held rigid with tension, softened slightly, and she asked what would happen to her family if she disappeared. What consequences would rain down on the Morrisons when the Blackwells realized their carefully orchestrated alliance had collapsed? Alexander had considered this, had spent the drive to the estate working through scenarios and contingencies. He told her he would handle it, would position her disappearance in a way that directed blame toward him rather than her father, would absorb the retaliation that Marcus would inevitably unleash. It was a promise that might cost him everything, but watching hope flicker to life in Elena's eyes, he found he didn't care about the price. She asked for time to think, and Alexander nodded, understanding that trust couldn't be demanded, only earned through patience and respect. He told her he would wait outside, would give her space to make a decision that should have always been hers to make. But as he turned toward the door, Elena's voice stopped him, stronger now, carrying a determination that hadn't been there moments before. She didn't need time, she said. She had spent her entire life waiting for permission to live, and she was done waiting. If he was offering her freedom, she would take it, would step into the unknown with nothing but the dress she wore and the fragile faith that anything was better than the future that had been planned for her. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, something he had thought permanently calcified cracking open to let in light he hadn't realized he needed. He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders, the expensive wool swallowing her smaller frame, and together they moved toward the door that would lead them both into territory neither had mapped. The estate grounds were dark and silent as they made their way through shadows and between surveillance blind spots, Elena's hand gripping his arm for balance as her impractical shoes navigated uneven ground. Alexander's car waited where he had left it, inconspicuous among the trees, and as they reached it, he paused to look back at the carriage house, at the life Elena was abandoning, with nothing but his word that something better existed beyond the walls that had contained her. They drove in silence through the suburbs and back toward the city, Elena watching the lights blur past her window with an expression that mixed fear and exhilaration in equal measure. Alexander's mind raced ahead, calculating next steps, safe locations, ways to shield her from the storm that would break when Marcus discovered what had happened. But beneath the strategy, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously like hope, as though in choosing to save her, he might have accidentally saved himself. The Boston skyline appeared ahead, glittering and indifferent, and Alexander knew that by morning, everything would change. The choice he had made in that cold darkness would reshape alliances, destroy carefully constructed plans, and set in motion events neither family could control. But as Elena turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting city lights and unspoken gratitude, Alexander Thornton discovered that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had absolutely no regrets. Alexander took Elena to a property he owned in Cambridge, a townhouse near Harvard Square that he had purchased years ago as an investment, but rarely visited. The building stood on a quiet street lined with old maples, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the streetlights, and the neighborhood carried an academic atmosphere that felt worlds away from the corporate towers where he spent most of his time. He unlocked the door and guided Elena inside, flipping switches that brought warm light to rooms furnished simply but comfortably, a stark contrast to both his sterile penthouse and the sparse carriage house where he had found her. She stood in the entryway, still wrapped in his coat, looking around with the cautious wonder of someone afraid that safety might evaporate if examined too closely. Alexander showed her to the guest room upstairs, a space with cream-colored walls and a window that overlooked a small garden where snow would soon cover the dormant rose bushes. He apologized for the dust, explaining that a cleaning service maintained the property, but hadn't been scheduled recently, and Elena smiled for the first time since they had met, a small, fragile expression that transformed her features and made her look younger, less burdened. She told him it was perfect, more than perfect, and the genuine gratitude in her voice made Alexander realize how little perfection she must have experienced, despite growing up surrounded by wealth and privilege. He left her there with assurances that she was safe, that no one knew about this property's connection to him, and went downstairs to make phone calls that couldn't wait until morning. His first call was to Margaret, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour, her voice alert with the constant readiness that came from years of managing crises. Alexander explained the situation in broad strokes, omitting details that would compromise Elena's privacy, but making clear that he had made a decision that would have severe repercussions and needed her help managing the fallout. Margaret listened without interruption, and when he finished, her response was characteristically direct. She asked if he had lost his mind, if he understood that interfering with a Blackwell family arrangement would trigger retaliation that could destroy everything they had built. Alexander confirmed that he understood, confirmed that he was proceeding anyway, and asked if she was with him, or if he should find someone else to navigate what came next. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Margaret sighed, a sound that carried both exasperation and loyalty in equal measure. She told him she had worked for his father and watched Alexander transform a dying company into an empire, had seen him make impossible decisions that somehow always proved correct, and she wasn't about to abandon him now even if his latest choice seemed incomprehensible. But she demanded honesty about his motivations, needed to know if this was strategy or something else entirely, because the approach would differ depending on what truly drove him. Alexander sat in the dark townhouse, phone pressed to his ear, and admitted what he barely understood himself. This wasn't about defeating Marcus Blackwell, wasn't about corporate advantage or revenge. This was about doing something right in a world where he had spent too long doing things that were merely effective. Margaret absorbed this with the pragmatism that defined her, then shifted into solution mode with impressive speed. They would need legal protection for Elena, documents that established her independence from her family, possibly a formal statement about coercion that would complicate any attempts to force her back into the arrangement. They would need security measures, not the obvious kind that would draw attention, but subtle monitoring that would alert them if the Blackwells or Morrisons attempted to locate her. And they would need a narrative, a story to explain Alexander's actions in a way that minimized damage to Thornton Industries and the people who depended on the company for their livelihoods. Alexander agreed to all of it, trusting her judgment as he always had, and ended the call feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified by what he had set in motion. He spent the next hour working from the townhouse's small study, sending encrypted messages to his legal team, his head of security, and select board members whose loyalty he needed to maintain. Each message was carefully crafted to reveal only what was necessary, to position his choice as calculated rather than impulsive, though he knew many would see through the facade. Around 2 a.m, exhaustion finally pulled at him with enough force that he couldn't ignore it, and he climbed the stairs intending to sleep in the master bedroom. But as he passed Elena's door, he heard soft sounds that stopped him, the muffled catch of breathing that indicated crying she was trying to suppress. Alexander knocked gently, and when she didn't respond, he opened the door a crack to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the white dress, tears streaming down her face in the lamplight. She apologized immediately, embarrassed to be caught in such vulnerability, but Alexander stepped inside and sat in the chair near the window, maintaining respectful distance while offering presence. He told her she had nothing to apologize for, that tears were a reasonable response to having your entire life uprooted in a single night, and this seemed to give her permission to stop fighting the emotion. She cried harder then, the kind of deep sobbing that comes from years of holding everything inside, and Alexander sat quietly, bearing witness to her pain without trying to fix it or minimize it. When the storm passed and Elena could speak again, she told him about her childhood in Charleston, about a mother who had died when she was 10, and a father who had never recovered from the loss, who had buried his grief in work and expectations, molding his daughter into the perfect negotiating piece without ever asking what dreams she might harbor for herself. She spoke about cousins who had escaped through scandalous elopements or strategic relocations, and how she had watched them be exiled from the family with a mixture of envy and fear. She described the moment her father had told her about the arrangement with Marcus Blackwell, how he had presented it as an honor, an opportunity, never once considering that she might want something different. And she confessed that until tonight, until Alexander had appeared in that carriage house offering impossible choices, she had convinced herself that wanting anything else was selfish. That duty was the highest form of love she could offer. Alexander listened to all of it, recognizing pieces of his own story woven through hers, the ways their families had shaped them into instruments of legacy rather than allowing them to be simply human. He told her about his mother's departure, about the note she had left that said she couldn't breathe anymore, couldn't continue being who everyone needed her to be, when it meant erasing who she actually was. He spoke about Caroline and the relief he felt knowing his sister had built a life beyond their father's shadow, even though it meant losing the only person who had truly known him. And he admitted that rescuing Elena might have been as much about rescuing himself, about proving that they weren't condemned to repeat the patterns that had damaged everyone they loved. They talked until dawn painted the sky pale gray beyond the window, sharing histories and fears with the intimacy that sometimes emerges between strangers who recognize each other's wounds. Elena asked what would happen next, and Alexander was honest about the uncertainty, about the likelihood that both the Blackwells and the Morrisons would come looking for her, about the difficult road ahead. But he promised her that whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone, that she had made the brave choice to claim her own life, and he would stand beside her as she figured out what that life should look like. Elena reached across the space between them and took his hand, a gesture of trust that felt more significant than any contract Alexander had ever signed. And he held on, knowing that in the morning they would both have to face the consequences of his shocking decision. The sun rose over Cambridge, painting the townhouse in golden light, and somewhere across the city, Marcus Blackwell was about to discover that his carefully constructed alliance had crumbled. Phones would ring, accusations would fly, and the war between the families would escalate to levels that would make previous conflicts seem like minor skirmishes. But in that quiet room, Alexander and Elena sat together in the fragile peace of dawn, two people who had spent their lives fulfilling others' expectations finally choosing to write their own story, regardless of who might try to stop them. The world outside would bring chaos and challenge, but for these few moments, they allowed themselves to simply exist, to breathe, to hope that freedom might be worth whatever price they would be forced to pay. The news broke before Alexander had finished his first cup of coffee. His phone erupted with calls and messages while he stood in the townhouse kitchen, the morning light streaming through windows that overlooked the quiet Cambridge street. Margaret's name flashed on the screen first, followed by board members, business partners, and finally his sister Caroline calling from California with a concern in her voice he hadn't heard in years. He answered Margaret first, listening as she detailed the firestorm that had ignited across Boston's business community. Marcus Blackwell had discovered Elena's disappearance just after 6 that morning, and within an hour, every major player in the city knew that Alexander Thornton had somehow interfered with the Blackwell-Morrison alliance. The story spreading through exclusive clubs and corporate offices painted Alexander as either brilliantly strategic or dangerously unhinged, and opinions seemed evenly split. Elena emerged from upstairs wearing clothes Alexander had quickly purchased from a 24-hour store during the early morning hours, simple jeans and a sweater that fit imperfectly, but transformed her from ceremonial bride into an ordinary young woman trying to navigate an extraordinary situation. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, testament to the emotional toll of the previous night. But something in her posture had changed. The defeated resignation that had characterized her in the carriage house had been replaced by a tentative determination, as though freedom, even frightening freedom, had unlocked something fundamental within her. Alexander offered her coffee and toast, normal gestures in an abnormal situation, and she accepted with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, both of them aware that the calm morning was temporary shelter before an inevitable storm. Margaret arrived at the townhouse by 9, carrying legal documents, security protocols, and a tablet filled with news alerts about the situation. She greeted Elena with professional warmth, asking practical questions about her needs and circumstances without judgment or excessive curiosity. and Alexander felt gratitude for his assistant's ability to treat crisis as merely another problem requiring efficient solutions. Margaret laid out the situation with characteristic bluntness. The Morrisons were claiming their daughter had been taken against her will, positioning themselves as victims to maintain face within their social circles and avoid appearing complicit in a broken agreement. The Blackwells were demanding Alexander's immediate arrest for interference in a private family matter, though their legal standing was questionable since no contracts had been formally signed and Elena was a legal adult capable of making her own decisions. The real danger, Margaret explained, came not from law enforcement, but from social and business pressure that both families could bring to bear. Several Thornton Industries partners had already expressed concern about continuing relationships with a company whose leader had demonstrated such unpredictable behavior, and 2 board members were quietly discussing votes of no confidence. The Morrison family controlled manufacturing contracts worth millions, and their allies were beginning to withdraw from negotiations with Thornton subsidiaries in a coordinated effort to inflict financial pain. Meanwhile, Marcus Blackwell was leveraging his considerable influence to freeze Alexander out of upcoming development projects, using whisper campaigns and strategic objections to turn what should have been routine approvals into bureaucratic nightmares. The message was clear. Returning Elena would make the problems disappear, while protecting her would cost Alexander everything he had built. Elena listened to all of this with growing distress, her fingers twisting together in her lap. And when Margaret finished, she spoke with a voice that trembled, but didn't break. She couldn't let Alexander destroy himself for her sake, couldn't watch him lose his company and reputation because of a choice she had influenced. She would return to her family, would fulfill the obligation she had been raised to accept, because the alternative was watching an innocent person suffer consequences meant for her. Alexander felt something fierce rise in his chest at her words, not anger but a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He told her firmly that she wasn't returning, that her freedom wasn't negotiable regardless of what it cost him, and that if she truly wanted to help, she would trust him to handle the situation his own way. Margaret observed this exchange with an expression that suggested she was reevaluating her understanding of her employer, seeing something in Alexander's determination that went beyond business calculation into territory that made her both concerned and oddly hopeful. She suggested they focus on legal protection first, establishing Elena's independence through formal documentation that would make it harder for either family to claim authority over her decisions. She had already contacted attorneys who specialized in emancipation cases. Though Elena was well past the age requiring such measures, the paperwork would create official record of her choice to separate from family control. Additionally, they needed Elena to provide a sworn statement about the circumstances of her engagement to Marcus, details about whether she had ever consented freely or been pressured into an arrangement she didn't want. Elena agreed to everything, following Margaret to the study where they spent the next 2 hours working through documents and statements, her voice growing stronger as she articulated experiences she had never been allowed to name as coercion. Alexander used the time to handle phone calls that couldn't be delegated, speaking with board members to shore up support, negotiating with partners who were wavering, and making strategic concessions that would minimize immediate damage to the company. Several conversations went poorly, colleagues who had worked with him for years expressing disappointment or confusion about his choices, questioning whether the Alexander Thornton they knew still existed. He weathered their doubts without defending himself, understanding that his actions appeared indefensible through the lens of pure business logic, accepting that some relationships would fracture beyond repair. Carolyn called again just after noon, and this time Alexander answered, bracing himself for the lecture he knew was coming. But his sister surprised him, her voice soft when she asked if he was all right, if he needed her to come back to Boston to help with whatever was happening. Alexander felt unexpected emotion tighten his throat at her concern, at the reminder that someone in his life cared about his well-being rather than just his utility. He explained the situation as succinctly as possible, prepared for Caroline to tell him he was being foolish, but instead she was quiet for a long moment, before saying she was proud of him. She told him their mother would have been proud too, that choosing compassion over conquest was the bravest thing she had seen him do, and that if he needed anything at all, he should call her immediately. The afternoon brought a new development that shifted the dynamic in unexpected ways. Elena's phone, which she had left behind at the estate, but which Alexander's security team had retrieved along with her other belongings, contained messages from her father that painted a different picture than his public statements. Richard Morrison hadn't claimed his daughter was taken. He had known she was desperately unhappy, but had convinced himself the marriage would eventually bring her contentment. The messages showed a man torn between family loyalty and paternal love, angry at Alexander for interfering, but also quietly relieved that his daughter had found the courage to escape a future that would have slowly destroyed her. He demanded to speak with Elena, to verify she was safe and acting of her own free will, and promised that if she confirmed this, he would withdraw his family's cooperation with the Blackwells' retaliation efforts. Elena read her father's messages with tears streaming down her face. Years of complicated emotions toward the man who had both loved and failed her rising to the surface. She asked Alexander if she could call him, if it was safe to make contact, and Alexander consulted with Margaret before agreeing, arranging for the call to be made from a secure line that couldn't be traced. The conversation between father and daughter was private, conducted in the study with the door closed, but when Elena emerged 30 minutes later, her eyes were red, but her expression carried something like peace. Her father had apologized, had admitted he had prioritized legacy over her happiness, and while he couldn't publicly support her choice without destroying his own standing within their community, he would ensure the Morrisons stopped actively working against Alexander's interests. It was a small victory in a larger war, but it mattered. With the Morrison family stepping back, the pressure on Thornton Industries decreased enough to give Alexander breathing room to strategize longer-term solutions. Marcus Blackwell remained furious, his pride wounded by the humiliation of a broken alliance and a bride who had chosen his enemy over him. But without the Morrisons' support, his ability to inflict damage was limited. Evening settled over Cambridge, bringing the kind of cold clarity that November in New England specialized in, and Alexander found himself sitting with Elena in the townhouse living room, both of them exhausted but cautiously optimistic that they might survive the immediate crisis. Elena asked him why he had really done it, pressed beyond the explanations he had given about being tired of the system, wanting to do something right. She needed to understand what would make a man risk everything for a stranger, and Alexander realized he owed her complete honesty. He told her that when he saw her in that carriage house, isolated and resigned to a future that would erase her, he saw every person he had ever failed to help because helping wasn't strategic. He saw opportunities for kindness he had ignored in pursuit of victory, relationships he had sacrificed to ambition, and the version of himself he might have become if he had chosen differently years ago. Saving her was about giving them both a chance at redemption, at proving that it wasn't too late to become people who valued human connection over power. Elena reached for his hand again, the gesture becoming familiar between them, and told him she understood because she felt it too. This sense that their meeting had been a turning point, neither of them had known they desperately needed. The attraction growing between them was undeniable, built on shared trauma and mutual respect. But both recognized it was too soon, too complicated, too tangled with gratitude and crisis to trust as genuine. They agreed without speaking to let whatever was developing between them unfold naturally, without pressure or expectations, focusing first on survival and then on discovering who they each were outside the roles their families had scripted. The night deepened around the townhouse, and somewhere in Boston, Marcus Blackwell plotted his next move, but inside that Cambridge sanctuary, two people who had spent their lives alone finally began to believe they might have found something worth fighting for together. 3 weeks passed in a strange, suspended reality where Alexander and Elena learned to navigate the space between their old lives and whatever future they were building. The townhouse in Cambridge became a cocoon of normalcy, insulated from the chaos still swirling through Boston's business circles, though neither of them was naive enough to believe the quiet would last forever. Alexander worked from the study, conducting video conferences and managing crises remotely, while maintaining enough physical distance from his usual haunts to protect Elena's location. She spent her days reading voraciously from the townhouse's neglected library, walking through Harvard Square wrapped in scarves against the deepening cold, and slowly discovering preferences and opinions she had spent 25 years suppressing. Margaret visited regularly, bringing updates on the external situation and supplies they needed, and her initial professional reserve toward Elena had gradually transformed into something warmer, almost maternal. She brought books she thought Elena might enjoy, asked about her interests with genuine curiosity, and occasionally stayed for dinner, the three of them sharing meals that felt remarkably ordinary, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. During one such evening, Margaret mentioned casually that she had never seen Alexander so present, so engaged with life beyond spreadsheets and strategy meetings. And the observation hung in the air with the weight of truth neither Alexander nor Elena was quite ready to examine too closely. The connection between them deepened incrementally, built through small moments rather than grand gestures. Alexander taught Elena to play chess in the evenings, amused by her aggressive style that prioritized intuition over conventional strategy, and she introduced him to classical music she had studied as a child, composers whose work he had never taken time to appreciate. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, discovering shared love of old architecture, morning coffee, and mystery novels, while carefully avoiding the question of what they were becoming to each other. The attraction was undeniable, electric in every accidental touch and lingering glance, but both recognized the dangerous territory they were navigating. Elena's gratitude toward Alexander could easily be mistaken for something deeper, and his protective instinct toward her might be confused with genuine affection, so they maintained boundaries, even as those boundaries grew increasingly difficult to honor. The fragile peace shattered on a gray December afternoon when Margaret arrived at the townhouse, with news that drained the color from Alexander's face. Marcus Blackwell had made a move they hadn't anticipated, one that demonstrated both his cunning and his determination to punish Alexander for the humiliation he had suffered. Marcus had uncovered information about Thornton Industries' expansion into sustainable energy, a project Alexander had been developing quietly for 2 years, pouring resources and passion into technology that could revolutionize how buildings consumed power. Through a series of strategic acquisitions and patent challenges, Marcus had positioned himself to either control the technology or ensure it never reached market, effectively holding hostage the project Alexander cared about more than any other business venture. The ultimatum was delivered through official channels, but with crystal-clear subtext. Return Elena to fulfill her obligations, and Marcus would release his claim on the patents and allow the sustainable energy project to proceed. Refuse, and he would bury the technology in legal challenges that would consume years and millions, ensuring Alexander's dream of creating something meaningful beyond mere profit died a slow bureaucratic death. It was brilliantly cruel, targeting not Alexander's wealth or reputation, but the one initiative that represented his attempt to build a legacy worth having, to contribute something positive to a world he had spent too long simply exploiting. Margaret laid out the options with her characteristic pragmatism, but Alexander could see in her eyes that she already knew what his answer would be, that some decisions transcended calculation. Elena listened to all of this with growing anguish, understanding finally the true cost of her freedom. She had known intellectually that Alexander was sacrificing for her, but seeing the specific price, watching him face the destruction of something he had created with genuine vision and hope, made the abstract concrete in ways that broke her heart. She left the room without speaking, and Alexander found her an hour later in the upstairs bedroom, packing the few belongings she had accumulated during their weeks together. She told him through tears that she couldn't let him lose everything for her sake, that the Sustainable Energy Project could help thousands of people while her freedom only benefited one, and that she had decided to return to her family and honor the arrangement with Marcus. Alexander felt panic rise in his chest, an emotion so foreign he almost didn't recognize it, and he crossed the room to take her hands in his, stopping her frantic packing with a gentle insistence. He told her she wasn't going back, that no project was worth her happiness, that he would find another way to bring the technology to market even if it took decades. But Elena shook her head, her tears falling faster now. explaining that she couldn't live with herself knowing she had destroyed his ability to do genuine good in the world. She had spent her whole life being a burden to people who were supposed to love her, and she wouldn't add Alexander to that list. Wouldn't be the reason he lost the thing that gave his work meaning beyond mere competition and conquest. Their argument crescendoed through the evening, both of them fighting for the other's well-being, with an intensity that finally forced them to acknowledge what had been growing between them since that first night in the carriage house. Alexander admitted that losing the project would hurt, but losing her would be devastating in ways he couldn't articulate, that somewhere in the past weeks, she had become essential to him in ways that terrified and thrilled him equally. Elena confessed that her gratitude had long since transformed into something deeper, that she had fallen for him, not because he rescued her, but because of who he was when the masks came off, thoughtful and vulnerable, and trying so hard to be better than the man his circumstances had shaped him to be. They stood in that bedroom surrounded by half-packed bags, the air between them charged with everything they had been avoiding, and Alexander made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. He kissed her, and she responded with a desperation that spoke of weeks of restraint finally breaking, and for several minutes nothing existed except the connection they had been denying themselves. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Elena whispered that this changed nothing about her decision to return, that loving him only strengthened her resolve to protect what mattered to him. But Alexander refused to accept her sacrifice, insisting there had to be another solution, some way to outmaneuver Marcus that didn't require either of them to surrender their newfound freedom. They spent the night brainstorming alternatives, fueled by coffee and desperation, examining the situation from every angle until exhaustion forced them to acknowledge they were thinking in circles. As dawn approached, bringing with it the deadline Marcus had set for Alexander's decision, Elena curled against Alexander on the living room sofa, both of them too tired to maintain the physical distance they had carefully preserved. She fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, and Alexander held her, feeling her breath even out into the peaceful rhythm of rest, knowing that in a few hours he would have to make a choice that would define both their futures. The sunrise painted the townhouse in shades of pink and gold, beautiful and indifferent to human struggle, and Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. He woke Elena gently, his hand stroking her hair with a tenderness that came naturally now, and told her he had found a solution, one that required trust and courage from both of them, but that might give them everything they wanted, without surrendering to Marcus's manipulation. Elena listened with hope dawning in her eyes as Alexander explained his plan, a gambit that would expose them both to risk, but that relied on the one thing Marcus Blackwell had never truly understood: that some people valued integrity more than victory, and that genuine connection was stronger than any strategic alliance could ever be. Margaret arrived at 8, prepared to hear Alexander's capitulation, but instead found them dressed and determined, ready to implement a plan that would either free them from Marcus's shadow permanently or destroy them both in spectacular fashion. The stakes had never been higher, the outcome never more uncertain. But as Alexander and Elena stood together facing what came next, they carried something Marcus, with all his calculated schemes, could never possess. The knowledge that whatever happened, they had chosen each other freely, completely, and that choice itself was a victory no external force could take away. Alexander's plan was audacious in its simplicity, relying on transparency in a world built on secrets and strategic deception. He scheduled a press conference for that afternoon, not at Thornton Industries headquarters, but at a neutral location, the historic Faneuil Hall, where public discourse had shaped American democracy for centuries. The symbolism was intentional, a statement that what he was about to do transcended business rivalry and entered territory of fundamental human rights. Margaret worked frantically to arrange logistics, while Alexander and Elena prepared statements, their hands occasionally brushing as they wrote, each touch a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. News of the press conference spread rapidly through Boston's interconnected elite circles, speculation running wild about what announcement could be significant enough to warrant such public theater. Marcus Blackwell called Alexander's phone repeatedly, his messages evolving from confused to threatening, as he realized control of the narrative was slipping from his grasp. Several board members demanded Alexander cancel the event, warning that whatever he planned to reveal would damage the company irreparably, but Alexander moved forward with a certainty that felt almost peaceful. He had spent his entire adult life making calculated decisions designed to minimize risk and maximize advantage. And where had it brought him except to a sterile penthouse, and a reputation built on fear rather than respect? If this gamble failed, at least he would fail while trying to do something genuinely right. The hall filled with journalists, business leaders, and curious observers drawn by the promise of scandal in Boston's upper echelons. Alexander stood at the podium with Elena beside him, her presence a statement in itself, and Margaret positioned near the exit in case they needed to leave quickly. Camera flashes created a strobe effect as Alexander began speaking, his voice steady as he explained exactly what had happened over the past month. He detailed finding Elena isolated in preparation for a marriage she had never freely chosen, described the arrangement between the Blackwells and Morrisons as what it was, a business transaction that treated a human being as negotiable property. He acknowledged his own role in Boston's ruthless business culture, admitted that his rivalry with Marcus had consumed years in pointless destruction, and stated clearly that he was done participating in systems that valued power over people. Elena spoke next, her voice trembling initially, but gaining strength as she described her experience, careful to focus on her own feelings and choices rather than attacking her family directly. She explained that she was speaking publicly, not to shame anyone, but to reclaim her narrative, to establish clearly that she had left of her own free will and would not be returning to fulfill obligations she had never truly accepted. She thanked Alexander for offering her choice when no one else had, but emphasized that her decision to stay was hers alone, made with full understanding of the consequences. The room was absolutely silent as she spoke, journalists recording every word of testimony that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Then Alexander revealed the part of his plan that would either save them or destroy everything. He announced that he was releasing all patents and research related to the Sustainable Energy Project into the public domain, making the technology freely available to anyone who wanted to develop it. Marcus Blackwell could no longer hold the project hostage because there was nothing left to hold, no proprietary advantage to withhold. Alexander explained that he had originally developed the technology, hoping to profit from doing good, but had realized that genuine positive impact mattered more than ownership. If making the research public meant more buildings would adopt sustainable practices faster, then the loss of competitive advantage was worth the environmental benefit. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, business reporters frantically typing updates, while environmental advocates in attendance began applauding. It was commercial suicide by conventional standards, surrendering valuable intellectual property that could have generated billions in revenue. But it was also strategically brilliant in ways that transcended profit. Alexander had removed Marcus's leverage completely, while simultaneously positioning himself as a leader willing to prioritize collective good over individual gain. The narrative shifted instantly from scandal about stolen brides to inspiration about ethical leadership, and Alexander watched Marcus Blackwell's carefully constructed retaliation crumble in real time. Questions erupted from reporters, but Alexander held up his hand, indicating he had one more statement. He looked directly into the cameras and addressed Marcus by name, his voice carrying none of its usual competitive edge, but instead a weariness that came from years of pointless conflict. He said that their families had been destroying each other for decades, that neither side could even remember what the original betrayal had been, and that he was tired of inheriting hatred like it was some precious heirloom worth preserving. He proposed they end the feud entirely, not through alliance or merger, but through simple cessation of hostilities, and invited Marcus to join him in redirecting their considerable resources toward building, rather than demolishing. The press conference ended in controlled chaos, journalists shouting questions while Alexander and Elena were escorted out by security Margaret had arranged. They didn't wait to see immediate reactions, didn't stay to manage the narrative's evolution, simply left the hall and returned to the Cambridge townhouse that had become their sanctuary. Margaret joined them an hour later, tablet filled with responses flooding in from around the world, and her expression carried something Alexander had rarely seen: genuine pride. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, framing Alexander as a man who had chosen conscience over conquest, and several business leaders were already reaching out to discuss collaboration on sustainable projects, now that the technology was freely available. But the response that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Richard Morrison called Elena's phone that evening, his voice thick with emotion, as he told his daughter he had watched the press conference and finally understood the courage it had taken for her to leave. He apologized for years of treating her as an asset rather than a person, admitted he had been wrong to arrange her life without consulting her heart, and asked if she might be willing to rebuild their relationship on new terms. Terms where her choices and happiness took precedence over family strategy. Elena cried through the entire conversation, years of complicated feelings toward her father finding resolution in his willingness to acknowledge his failures and change. Marcus Blackwell never responded publicly to Alexander's olive branch, his pride too wounded to accept peace offered by the man who had humiliated him. But the absence of further retaliation spoke volumes, and gradually the business community accepted that the legendary Thornton-Blackwell rivalry had simply ended, not with dramatic conclusion, but with one side choosing to walk away from the battlefield entirely. Some board members at Thornton Industries resigned in protest of Alexander's decision to release the patents, convinced he had lost his business acumen, but others stayed, intrigued by the possibility of building a company that measured success differently. Winter deepened over Cambridge, snow transforming the townhouse garden into something pristine and quiet, and Alexander and Elena settled into a rhythm that felt remarkably like happiness. They made their relationship official slowly, in small increments, first admitting they were dating, then acknowledging they were in love, finally accepting that what had begun in crisis had transformed into something enduring and real. Elena enrolled in graduate school to study social work, channeling her experience into helping others trapped by family expectations, while Alexander restructured Thornton Industries around sustainable development and ethical business practices, discovering that profitability and principles didn't have to be mutually exclusive. On a February evening 6 months after the press conference, Alexander and Elena walked through Harvard Square hand in hand, anonymous among students and tourists, their breath creating clouds in the cold air. They stopped at a small Italian restaurant they had discovered during their early weeks together, and over pasta and wine, Alexander produced a small velvet box that made Elena's eyes widen. The ring inside was simple, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Marcus had presented during their 3 awkward dinners. And when Alexander asked if she would marry him, he made clear it was a question, not an expectation, an invitation she was free to accept or decline without consequence to their relationship. Elena said yes through tears, not because she felt obligated or because it made strategic sense, but because she had found in Alexander a partner who valued her autonomy as much as her presence, who had proven through actions, not words, that her happiness mattered more than any advantage her commitment might bring. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the townhouse, attended by Caroline, who flew in from California, Margaret, who had become family in every way that mattered, and Richard Morrison, who gave his daughter away with genuine joy, grateful she had found the courage he had lacked to choose love over legacy. The years that followed brought challenges and triumphs in measures that felt proportionate to real life rather than fairy tales. Thornton Industries thrived under Alexander's new leadership philosophy, attracting employees and partners who shared his values, while Elena's work helping young people escape coercive family situations gained recognition and funding. They had 2 children eventually, a daughter and son they raised with emphasis on autonomy and authentic choice, determined to break the generational patterns that had nearly destroyed them both. Marcus Blackwell remained a presence in Boston business circles, diminished but not destroyed, and occasionally their paths crossed at charity events or city functions, acknowledgement passing between them that held neither warmth nor hostility, simply acceptance of shared history. On quiet evenings, Alexander and Elena would sometimes return to the Cambridge townhouse, which they had kept even after purchasing a larger home for their growing family, and sit in the living room where they had spent those first intense weeks falling in love while the world demanded they surrender. Elena would curl against Alexander on the same sofa where she had once slept while he held her, and they would talk about how strange and wonderful it was that a choice made in darkness had led them to such light, that rescuing each other had been the bravest and best decision either had ever made. The story of the Alpha King who shocked everyone became, in the retelling, something simpler and more profound. A story about two people who recognized each other's humanity when the world insisted they were only symbols in a larger game, who chose connection over conquest, and discovered that real power lay not in dominating others, but in having the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to love, without guarantee of safety. And in choosing each other, they had found freedom neither could have claimed alone, building lives that honored their authentic selves rather than the roles their families had scripted, proving that even in a world structured around legacy and expectation, it was still possible to write your own ending, one brave choice at a time.